So from the Russian point of view, this was always going to happen. The only question was timing. And so the Russians have tended to get invaded over 50 times in their history through those open, flat territories. So the Russian goal going back to Catherine the Great has always been the same. Expand beyond those flats until you can control the gateways that give access to the Russian space. Places like the Timir Gap in Central Asia, or the Altai Gap going to China, or the Baltic Sea coast. And when the Soviet Union existed, they controlled all 9 of the gateways. When it was reduced to rump Russia, they went from 9 to 1. And everything that Putin has done since has been about getting Russian boots into those gaps to secure it for the future. So we had the uprising in Kazakhstan. Russian troops went. That plugged the gap. We had the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict last summer. Russian troops went in as part of the peacekeeping group. They plugged a gap. The Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. They went in, they took it, they plugged a gap. And 2 of the remaining gaps are on the other side of Ukraine, specifically the Polish and Bessarabian gaps that in the past the Germans or the Turks have used to invade. Putin felt he needed to act very quickly. If you remember back to the impeachment hearings for Donald Trump, the very, very short version is that Trump admitted publicly to blackmailing the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, in order to get some dirt on the Biden family. And when that didn't work, he suspended military transfers to Ukraine. Now, under Biden, those military transfers had started up again, and in November of last year is when the Javelin anti-tank missiles started making it to the front. And the Russians realized that the balance of forces were shifting against them, and so they realized they needed to go now, and that's where we are. By keeping that conflict hot for 8 years, they did the single best thing they could have done to consolidate the Ukrainian national identity. Most people in Ukraine before that didn't even think of themselves as Ukrainian, especially in the eastern half of the country. Now they do. And we have seen on the Russian side is mind-boggling. It is worse than what the Iraqis were doing during the first Desert Storm conflict. So if they had done this back in 2014, 2015, they probably would have been in Kiev in a couple of weeks, and they probably would have conquered the entire country in less than 3 months. Now we're probably looking at double the amount of time, and then they'll be facing a raging firestorm of a guerrilla war in order to occupy a country of 45 million people. This is shaping how the United States views the conflict. Because when this first happened, we just assumed that they would steamroller the Ukrainian forces. They're outnumbered, they're outgunned, their logistical capacity is awful, they have very few pieces of heavy equipment that you could stand up to a major Russian assault. But that convoy really changed minds in Washington, both in DOD and the White House, because we saw this 40-mile convoy that should have been able to just devastate Kiev, and it stalled out in a day because it ran out of fuel, and then its troops abandoned it 2 days later because they ran out of food. You know, that's Keystone Cops invasion stuff. And so we now know that if an American force comes up against a Russian force, the Russian force is going to be obliterated. And while that might make us feel good in terms of a conventional war, for the Russians, this is an issue of absolute national security for them. And if American forces of any type become involved in that kind of conflict, the Russians will have 2 choices: a humiliating strategic withdrawal that they may never recover from, or escalate to nukes. So the plan in NATO, the plan in Washington now, is to feed as many weapon systems as we can into the Ukrainian space. Anything that does not require a fixed point support. So no planes, no fixed air defense assets, but lots of missiles, lots of vehicles, and keep the Russians locked down on Ukraine as long as possible. Because if they can't finish Ukraine to their satisfaction, there's no point in them then rolling further west to get to their real goals. So this has become the Russian killing field. That's the plan now, to make sure that this is the last war that Russia can ever fight anywhere. The Russian birth rate has been declining for decades. And when you have things like famines or World War, you have a lot of people who are killed, the birth rate in those years is significantly lower. And the Russians have had these things stack on top of each other, because there was World War I, then there was World War II, then there was collectivization, then there was Brezhnev. And at each stage, the kind of the melon scoop out of the demographic structure got bigger, with the biggest one of all being the post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s. Well, the people who were born in the post-Soviet collapse are now about to be all of the draftable population. The Russian demography is now in terminal decline. It is the second worst demography on the planet, second only to China. There's a topic we can kick into later. And so the Russians are literally running out of soldiers. If they didn't do this attack now, if they waited 5 years, it would be too late. They wouldn't have the army to try. And that has kind of melon scooped not just out their troops, but also their skilled labor and their leadership potential, and that includes their military leadership. So it could be nothing more than the Russian officer corps has become so small and so unskilled that this is all they can do. I have a hard time hanging my hat on that completely, but even if it's true, the Ukrainians are still going to lose this war. They're massively outnumbered, and the Russians have shown that they have a high tolerance casualties, and the political situation in Russia has not turned against Putin. Sure, that we've seen protests, and of course Western media has followed that with ghoulish detail, but we're talking about a country that has lost millions of people in wars in the past. We're nowhere close to that. And if you add up all of the protests that have happened throughout Russia through the entirety of the last 3 weeks, you're still talking less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. Most Russians are fully on board with this, either because they understand exactly what's at stake, the future of the Russian ethnicity's existence, or they buy into the propaganda. And right now, that is the only information they're seeing. My personal opinion is that the best modern president we've had is George Herbert Walker Bush, because he presided over the end of the Cold War without a shot being fired, and he set us on the path to getting rid of 80% of the nuclear weapons on the planet. Those are a couple huge wins from my point of view, and part of the reason it worked so well is he always told people, never dance on the wall. If you've got the Russian system that is self-disarming and self-moving away from dictatorship, you do not brag about that publicly. You help them do it behind the scenes if you need to, in public if it makes sense. And because of that, he was able to push something that he called the New World Order, or the 1,000 Points of Light, if you remember that. And the whole idea was to have a conversation among the American people about what kind of world we wanted to bequeath to the next generation. Now that the Soviet monster was gone, what do we want? And we decided we didn't want to have that conversation. We punished him for it. And in the next 7 elections, we voted in the candidate who wanted to do less with the world. And when we got to this most recent one between Biden and Trump, we had two populists running who didn't even talk about American leadership at all. The only difference in terms of foreign economic policy between the two of them is that Trump ruled by tweet and then just let everything fall, whereas Biden is actually institutionalizing Trump-ish populism into American trade law and foreign policy, which makes it even more surprising that Biden has taken such a strong stance here on Ukraine. So, the fault is ours. We're the ones who have elected a litany of leaders who are populist, who have not been interested in foreign affairs, and that's led to this point. If we had stuck with George Herbert Walker Bush 25 years ago, now it's been, we'd probably be in a very different place.